So actually, Jessica is going to start us off today.
So I'm just going to give a little brief introduction to our project. I am going to speak for Sena and we're excited to be here today to talk to you about this work. We wanted to do this project to establish a community service that we feel is really essential to Guilford County. So we wanted to establish this aphasia group. And we were also interested in evaluating preliminary efficacy of a bi-monthly type of conversation group, because most of the research out there looks at groups that are offered much more frequently. And Sena's going to give you some of the background on that. But we thought that this would be a very clinically feasible approach to offering group services to people with aphasia. And we'll talk more about why. We also want to disclose that our project was or is supported by a new faculty research grant through the university. And I will let Sena take over now. And thanks for coming. You're on mute too.
I tell you. So before we start talking specifically about our aphasia conversation group project and the research, it's important for us to give you just a little background about aphasia, especially because so many people are still unfamiliar with aphasia. And we hope that you will see, based on what we're talking about, that there's this connection between aphasia, quality of life, mental health, social connectedness, and functional outcomes, and how those factors make it critical for people with aphasia to have access to aphasia conversation groups. So we're going to start with just some basic facts about aphasia, and please bear with us if you're already really well versed in aphasia. So aphasia is an acquired language disorder, and it could be caused by a variety of medical conditions like stroke or head injury. It can impact speaking, listening, reading, writing, or any combination of them. And because people with aphasia have difficulty communicating, and socializing involves communication, people with aphasia often experience social isolation and sometimes exclusion from activities. And it's still surprising that even though over 180,000 Americans are impacted by aphasia every year, still so many people don't know what it is. There is no medical cure for aphasia, even though there are treatments like speech therapy. And the deficits often persist long after what we would consider the spontaneous recovery period. So it's often lifelong. And when I say the spontaneous recovery period, I'm talking about that period up to maybe 9 months to a year after onset, while the brain is still healing and adapting and reorganizing. And we wouldn't expect someone after this spontaneous recovery period to experience complete recovery. But people with aphasia, if they have access to appropriate treatment and resources and support, they can continue to improve in their communication skills, even 10 years and beyond after onset, because of brain neuroplasticity. So aphasia can cause different patterns of language breakdown. For some people, it may be easier to produce language, but comprehension is a challenge. For others, it could be the opposite, where production is very difficult, but comprehension is relatively easy. And then there's individual variability. But the hallmark of aphasia is word finding difficulty. So we thought we'd share with you a couple of videos. So let me stop sharing this so you can see what a couple of more common forms of aphasia look like. So first we'll look at Broca's aphasia. And that is more related to an aphasia of expressive communication, often word finding. Give me 1 second to get that video going. Okay, so here's Broca's.
I do.
And what do you do now?
Voices of Hope, aphasia.
And what is Voices of Hope?
Peterburg, and Dr. Hinckley and myself founder for me. And members.
So hopefully you can see in there this difficulty with word finding. His communication is not fluent because of that word finding difficulty. And then now I want to show you a video of someone with Wernicke's aphasia. And this is one that's known to be more involved in comprehension.
They're diving for them at the moment. But they'll save in the moment. He'll water very soon for him. With luck for him.
So we're on a cruise and we're about to.
We will store it right here and they'll save their hands right there for them.
And what were we just doing with the iPad?
Right at the moment they don't show a darn thing.
The iPad that we were doing. Like here?
I might change for me and change hands for me. It would happen. I would talk with Donna sometimes. We're all with them. Other people are working with them.
So let me go back to our presentation. And so with Wernicke's, I'm sure you could see that, there were some pretty good sentences, but the comprehension was a challenge. So presentation. Okay. So let's see if we can talk about the word finding deficits that are involved in aphasia. And it's important to note that people with aphasia don't lose their words. The words are still there in their brain. The challenge is in accessing those words. So they still know what things are, they still know how to use things, but finding where that word is stored is the challenge. And I need to point out that, we all know what it feels like to occasionally have word finding difficulty. We know that sensation of having the word on the tip of our tongue. But with people with aphasia, that occurs far more frequently. And speech pathologists work with people who have aphasia to address specific language deficits like word finding difficulty. And the aim is to improve functional communication, like being able to communicate one's wants and needs, ask for help, say I love you to a loved one. So those functional types of communication skills. And so typical aphasia treatment would focus on improving specific communication skills with the goal of improving communication outcomes. And just to name a few treatment targets, there might be care partner training, in which you teach the care partner how to use supportive communication strategies with the person with aphasia. We might train the patient in compensatory strategies to help support communication, like to help with word finding. And treatment could also include the life participation approach to aphasia, LPAA. And so I'm highlighting LPAA because it relates so well with the purpose of aphasia conversation groups. It's based more on a social model than the medical model. And the purpose is to address the issue of social isolation that so many people with aphasia experience. And there are 5 basic components to LPAA, but the basic purpose is to help make life better for the person living with aphasia. It's about helping people with aphasia get back to living and enjoying the things that they did before the aphasia. So we talked about some specific treatment treatments that we would give as speech pathologists to people with aphasia, but now we can talk about aphasia conversation group. So we're getting closer to talking about the study. So in these groups, the focus is on facilitating conversation more so than improving specific skills. And the groups support social engagement. And again, so much of this is to address the risk of isolation. And it increases the sense of community in people with aphasia. So, okay, why else are aphasia conversation groups important? In order to improve one's language skills, and I think this will be common sense to everybody, in order to improve language skills, we need to practice communicating. And so one also needs to know how to use compensatory strategies to support communication. And that's something that people can learn through aphasia support groups. And Jessica will talk some about some of the supports that we provide during our group. And so both the people with aphasia and their care partners need to know how to use these strategies. It's beneficial to people with aphasia to experience communication in naturalistic context. And for example, that would mean that there'd be some natural consequences. So I say something, if the other person doesn't understand, there may be that it's obvious that they don't understand and they may want to ask for further clarification or just for you to add more to whatever the topic is. And it encourages multimodality communication. And when I say multimodality, I'm suggesting that someone with aphasia may need to use a variety of methods and modalities to communicate their message. Could be gesture, could be pointing, well, that's gesture. It could be writing something down. It could be drawing a picture. It could be just being able to say the first letter of a word that they're trying to think of. And so whatever resources that person needs to get their message across. And then these groups are also important because insurance coverage for therapy often comes to an end, but the aphasia is still there. And the person with aphasia still needs support and often still has the potential to improve their communication function. And I saw this in some of the facilities where I work, where we'd have someone with aphasia and maybe their insurance coverage ran out. So they were to be discharged from the facility, sometimes discharged home by themselves, but still with significant communication needs, sometimes even related to safety, right? Like being able to call 911. So my point is that people with aphasia still may have communication needs even after they're no longer in specific skilled speech therapy. So more about why we started our project. Community groups provide a nice alternative or a supplement to skilled speech therapy. Foley et al. Reported that social participation interventions that are evidence-based are vital to providing social support and to give opportunities for practice and conversation. And when we started talking about developing this project, there weren't any aphasia-specific groups in Guilford County. There's a stroke support group. There are some aphasia support groups in outlying counties, but we didn't have one in Guilford County. So we created Club Aphasia of the Triad, CAT, and that was to provide social support for those with aphasia in our community. I'm going to add a little side note that it was probably a little risky to name it CAT because I know some people with aphasia who have avoided groups with names that, like if there's one that's called Puzzle Group and they didn't like puzzles, they didn't want to attend that group. So anyone who didn't like cats, we risked that they wouldn't attend our group. But we haven't seen that as a problem so far. So in addition to aphasia's impact on communication function, relationships, and life participation, mental health can also be affected in people with aphasia. There is increased risk of generalized anxiety disorder. There's increased risk of depression, and mood is a key predictor of quality of life post-stroke. About 70% of people with aphasia will experience signs or symptoms of depression 3 months post-onset. And 1 year post-onset, 62% of people with aphasia are reporting signs and symptoms of depression. And we know that symptoms of depression are, when they're decreased, people with aphasia will experience greater functional outcomes. And so, okay, so all of this is leading up to the fact that there is this relationship between having aphasia, and I said this in the beginning, but this is just the reminder, between having aphasia, quality of life, mental health, social connectedness, and functional outcomes. And so looking at the CDC's definition of health-related quality of life, it includes having community-level resources and conditions, policies, and practices that influence a population's health perceptions and functional status. And so developing an aphasia conversation group is part of us providing this community-level resource. So more in terms of quality of life, people with severe aphasia are more likely to have greater impact in quality of life than someone who has mild to moderate aphasia. And this fact might be interesting, that quality of life is impacted more by having aphasia than by other major health conditions like cancer and dementia. People with aphasia are more impacted in terms of their level of independence, their environment, and their social engagement than those without aphasia. And so SLPs, speech language pathologists, can make efforts to support people with aphasia's quality of life by involving the person with aphasia and the care partner in treatment, so both, by facilitating the ability to adapt to life with aphasia, by encouraging social engagement, promoting general health and wellness. But realistically, there's only so much an SLP can do within this traditional therapy paradigm. And traditional therapy is often very lengthy, with a lengthy evaluation process, and time and resources are limited. So this is where aphasia conversation groups come in. These groups help with rebuilding identity. So we may have someone who was an extroverted public speaker one day, have a stroke, and then literally in an instant has profound difficulty communicating due to aphasia. And this invariably affects one's sense of self and identity. So by joining an aphasia conversation group, the person's experiences and their story are validated, and they become part of this community narrative of other people with aphasia, other people living well with aphasia. So they can then reframe their stories and their experiences in a way that reflects that they're moving forward with life. People with aphasia are welcomed into a community that accepts and nurtures them. And here are just some examples of what makes like an effective group. And so we do see this in our group, instilling hope, the sense of catharsis, sharing of information, interpersonal learning and communication. So we're getting closer to our study. The research in terms of group treatment and aphasia, the research right now is really looking at the goals involved in aphasia groups and aphasia treatment. They're looking at comparing efficacy between traditional, like one-on-one speech therapy compared to group therapy. And again, like the key word is therapy. Needing to understand what makes groups work, so what makes them effective. Current research is looking at matching the intensity and frequency of traditional treatment with group treatment. But our project is different because, as Jessica mentioned early, our group is clinically feasible because it's just twice a month. So a clinician should be able to host an aphasia group twice a month. And because the group is not goal driven, because it's not treatment, It's also clinically feasible because we're open to anyone with aphasia. We don't have to spend a lengthy amount of time evaluating everyone who comes to see what they might need and to see how we can support their communication growth. We can see everybody, but all within this conversation context. And also with this study, we're really hoping, and I think Jessica mentioned this in the beginning, we're hoping that the results of this study are something that we can share with SLPs out in facilities. And so if they want to host an aphasia conversation group, that with our data that they may be able to convince their employers and those facilities to give them the time and the resources to be able to hold an aphasia group like this. And in our study, as we said, it's feasible to have a bi-monthly group and that we provide a needed service. So that may be one of the most important things about our conversation group, that this is filling that gap that we had in our community. So now on to Jessica.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about our current study, and I just want to add one thing I think we forgot to mention in the background is that a lot of facilities and insurance companies will not reimburse groups. So that's one of the reasons that it's important to get some efficacy, work behind what it takes to make a group help people, because we know that groups that are conducted, twice a week are useful for people on a number of different levels, but we don't know, what type of frequency, where the frequency reduction really drops off and makes group less successful. So we were interested in looking at this bi-monthly schedule because of that, because we think it is something SLPs can do, and maybe get some support from their administration. Okay. So like we've mentioned so far, we were interested in determining if participation in an aphasia conversation group would positively impact the quality of life, participation within the community, and overall communication ability of our members with aphasia. So we're going to be focusing primarily on research question 1 here, which was specifically asking about quality of life, feelings about communication, and aphasia. So to evaluate this question, we administered a standardized test called the Assessment of Living with Aphasia, which gets input from the person with aphasia on multiple domains of their life that would give a picture of whether they're living successfully with aphasia. And we'll go over some examples of that in the next couple slides. We also had a qualitative piece to this research question. We conducted semi-structured interviews with our members to, hear in their own words how they feel about their current level of participation, their current level of communication, and life since their stroke. So we were expecting these things to change in a positive direction for our members as a result of participating in the group. For research question 2, we wanted to know if general communication ability would improve as a result of participation. In this study, we used a global language test, and this is really looking at the impairment level of language function. So looking at, ability to retrieve specific words, ability to construct a sentence, ability to understand a paragraph. So we would expect less change in a measure like this because our group isn't really about working at this impairment level on the specifics of language construction. And we'll talk more about that as well coming up. So the assessment of living with aphasia is based on the model that you see here. This is called the AFROM. It is a framework for outcome measurement in people with aphasia that for those of you who work in healthcare or have worked in healthcare, you'll see a lot of parallels with the ICF model. So you can see you have 4 major domains here. The first one we see is participation. This is someone with aphasia's ability to return to the roles and responsibilities and activities that they want to in their life. Here you have environment. These refer to things in the environment that facilitate success or are barriers to success to living with aphasia. At the bottom, you see the aphasia itself. So this refers to the impairment that aphasia causes. This could be word retrieval, this could be sentence construction, etc. And then to the right, you have the personal. So this refers to someone's feelings about themselves, feelings about their communication, feelings about the future. So the ALA evaluates each of these domains within a person's life to get a picture of how successfully they're living with aphasia. Here are a couple of examples of how this is done using the ALA. So this first one, you see the person with aphasia is asked to rate their aphasia, and this would fall under the aphasia domain. So they would rate their talking on a scale of 1 to 4, their understanding, their reading, and their writing. And then this second example says, how do you feel? And this rates the personal domain, which you can see here, they rate feelings of loneliness, of frustration, of depression, and of anger. So one of the huge benefits of this assessment is that it's aphasia friendly. So you can imagine that someone that has a language or communication limitation, many standardized tests that evaluate cognition or language or quality of life are not necessarily aphasia friendly. So that's one of the huge benefits of this assessment. So when we initiated this project, it was back in fall of 2019, and we will go through the timeline more specifically coming up, but we wrote the new faculty research grant, and this is what we were planning to do. So we recruited most of our participants from the Speech and Hearing Center here at UNCG and from speech pathologists in the community. Our conversation group met in person for an hour and a half, twice a month, and we completed a pre-assessment either just before someone entered the group and began the conversation group, or shortly after attending the first group session. The participant had to attend 6 sessions within 6 months, and then they did the post-group assessment. And this group is not driven by participant goals. It's only driven by conversation or communication. And our goal was to recruit 15 participants with chronic aphasia to attend the group, and then 15 participants in a control group to compare, our changes in terms of quality of life. So when we conceived this group, it was important to establish some principles for how we wanted our conversation group to be run. And here you can see some of the guiding principles that we work hard to implement and maintain in our group sessions. And I'm going to give you examples of these in the next slides. So first and foremost is support. Sena and I both facilitate the aphasia group, and our primary job as facilitators is to help our members with aphasia get their message out. So this includes any support we can think of. It could be pictures. We could write choices for them on a whiteboard. We ask yes or no questions if we need to clarify something. We will confirm information to make sure that we've understood correctly, encourage multimodality communication like gestures and drawing, and also summarize information to help our other members comprehend. We also facilitate. That's what we call ourselves, facilitators in the group. And this really refers to managing the flow of conversation, making sure that, you know, everyone is talking. And this is mostly accomplished by just being curious and asking questions, recognizing that not everyone is going to have something to say about a specific topic, and that's okay. We try to introduce new topics, but if our members don't like them, then we move on and see also what they have to say. Sena and I are members of the group, which means we share our own stories as well. And that often encourages the members to share their stories too. And we also try to encourage engagement. So as you guys saw in the videos that Sena showed, aphasia can look really different depending on where the brain damage has occurred in that individual. So some people might struggle more just initiating and just getting out their first words. So if we see something like that, then we do try to, you know, actively encourage engagement, maybe ask a yes/no question that gets that person the floor in the conversation so that they can then contribute what they're interested in contributing. And then a very difficult one is to allow silence to happen. Silence feels very uncomfortable in a group or, you know, most conversations, but it's often when we get the most initiation from our members. So when there's a silence, we try to wait it out for one of the members to initiate. We focus on function, not form. So this is a shift because Sena and I are both speech pathologists. So the goal of the conversation is just to get people conveying their message. It doesn't matter how it's produced as long as they've successfully conveyed what they intend to convey. So we do not, we do not focus on errors. We don't demand perfect productions. If there is an error that impacts comprehension, then we will ask follow-up questions or summarize so that the other members can understand. And this piece is, I think, one of the most difficult for us to establish and maintain in our group. Communicative equity is not something, I guess, a lot of us think about too often, but in the group, it's really important that we provide an environment for the members to feel comfortable talking, initiating, and sharing their personal information. This doesn't mean that we expect every member to talk the same amount of time during each group. It means that they actually have communicative power. They have the option to share or to not share about a topic, or to answer a question or not answer, or disagree or agree. And this often means that we have to avoid some traditional clinician-client roles, which are rooted in the medical model and, a very impairment-based model, and try to acknowledge the competence of our members with aphasia and acknowledge their expertise. So if a person with aphasia asks a question, they might direct it to Sena or I, and we open it up to the group. So, if they're asking a question about recovery, then we want to know what the other group members' experience with recovery has been. And this can be difficult to establish because people with aphasia aren't used to having any communicative power. They often since the time of their stroke, are used to being talked over, talked about, not talked to. And many people assume that they are not able to participate in deep or meaningful conversations because of their communication limitation. So a primary goal of our group is to uncover that competence and help people start to regain their communicative power and equity. And this includes avoiding therapy. So we don't ask test questions that we already know the answer to. So an example of this would be if I know a member has gone to the beach over the weekend, instead of asking, where'd you go this weekend in our meeting, I would say something like, how was your trip to the beach? And this is a subtle difference, but it's acknowledging that we have this shared information. We do not make evaluative comments about someone's language. So we would not say good talking or that was a great sentence. This is not something that we normally do in conversation, and it's not something we do in our conversation group. And we avoid interview style conversation. So it's not a Q&A. It is a time for everyone to share. And then, of course, any didactic type task we would avoid. So naming pictures or answering comprehension questions, etc. And last principle is just to be flexible. Conversation is an incredible feat of language because it is dynamic and always changing. And that requires us to be flexible. So we might have some ideas of things to talk about, but if nobody wants to, then we throw them out and we let the conversation go where the members want it to go, which means we pay close attention for opportunities to expand and extend on topics that they initiate. So here is the timeline that our study has, kind of followed. So we kind of started thinking about this back in the fall of 2019, which was my first semester here at UNCG, and I think Sena's second year. So we received the new faculty research grant in 2020 in January, and we started our group. We had 4 participants tested and 2 were scheduled. And then in March, something we certainly did not foresee happened, and the university was shut down due to COVID-19, and all of our group sessions were canceled. People with aphasia are a high-risk population. They are older adults, typically, and they also have pre-existing conditions related to stroke and all of the things that cause stroke. So we hit the brakes in March, and I can speak for myself, but I certainly didn't think that I would still be thinking about COVID-19 in March 2021. And so we didn't initially make plans to, switch the group to a virtual format. We were just planning to wait until things returned to normal. And then in September of 2020, we realized that things were not returning to normal anytime soon. And that's when we planned and began initiating the virtual group sessions. So we switched from face-to-face to a Zoom platform. And we did some training sessions with our clients to make sure that they would be able to participate through Zoom and had some of the basic tech requirements for Zoom. And we did repeat pre-group assessments. At this point, only 3 of the members we had previously tested came back. 1 came back, but really was not interested in doing the assessment over Zoom. So she was not re-enrolled in the study. And then January and February of this year, we did post-testing for the 3 participants who came back. And we'll talk a little bit about our continued recruitment and new initiatives coming up. So just a little about our group pre-COVID, and then we'll talk about the changes we made after COVID. But the group's open to anyone with aphasia. This is usually people that have had a stroke and sometimes people with traumatic brain injury. We met in person at UNCG on Tuesday evenings. The care partner of the person with aphasia could attend the first meeting, but then we asked that the person with aphasia attend independently. And this is because we really want to give the person with aphasia the chance to develop their communicative independence. And sometimes that can be difficult with a care partner present. Not always, but sometimes. Sena and I are there to facilitate the group, or were there when we were in person. And we also had student facilitators present. And we would match facilitators with people with aphasia based on the person with aphasia's needs. So if someone with aphasia needs more assistance comprehending, then they would have a facilitator with them to write keywords to assist in their comprehension. A typical agenda would be, meet and greet, conversation about current events, and then we might play a game or, continue conversation about specific topics. During the group meetings, there was always a number of methods to support communication present. And each time we had a new member, we would do a very, brief introduction to these methods and always try to model their use during our sessions. So these include things like facilitating notebooks that have picture supports, whiteboards and markers that we can write keywords on to aid in comprehension, or the person with aphasia can write on. Some attendees would bring computer-based augmentative and alternative communication devices that were personalized to them, in which case they might be independent with that device, or a facilitator might help them navigate the device. And we already talked about facilitators being paired with people with aphasia to support them. Here's an example of the notebook that we use in some of the picture supports. So here you can see a timeline for people talking about, when an event happened. It's a little outdated, but here's an example. I don't think anyone's talking about 1900 too often. And on the other side of the screen, you can see pictures of important people in most of our lives that might come up in stories or in conversation. So that's a picture support for that. Here we have a calendar. So this can be helpful when telling stories, and a map of the world. So if someone is trying to explain where they went on vacation, they have this map that they can use for support. This is only one option. We also have local maps. So, depending on where they travel. Then when we transitioned to Zoom meetings in September or fall of this year, sorry, I've seen chat pop up and I want to answer it, but I'm going to let Sena deal with the chat and I'm going to just keep talking. So we transitioned to Zoom meetings. We're still open to anyone with aphasia. We sometimes get contacted by people out of state who want to attend our groups, which we do, let them attend at this point since we're virtual. But we always try to also connect them with groups local to their area. Care partners now can attend the group, and this is largely to help deal with some of the technology issues. Now, sometimes care partners are better at this and sometimes they're not, but it can be quite difficult to troubleshoot tech problems if someone has any comprehension issues. So that's certainly something we work with care partners on. Sena and I are still always present, and we also have a student facilitator. One thing that has really changed since we transitioned to Zoom is that we have less facilitators, because we can't really pair with an individual person with aphasia. We are all in the same Zoom room space at the same time. So you don't really have that more one-to-one support. Initially, our Zoom meetings mirrored our in-person sessions, but they've transitioned to be much more free-flowing with less structure. So conversation is on current events, and usually centered around aphasia, is pretty much every group. And this was a bit of a necessity because of some of the issues around Zoom. So if we were to share a screen with some pictures to facilitate conversation, that would mean our members couldn't see each other's faces very well. And that tends to be a big barrier for initiating and maintaining a rich conversation. So we try to really balance using supports with the ability just to see each other, which is important. So you can see that point also here. We often use the Zoom whiteboard to write keywords or, help with comprehension. But again, we try to only do that when absolutely necessary, because it does mean people can't see each other as well. A lot of our members join through iPads, and that is, makes it even harder. The faces are even smaller on an iPad. Attendees continue to use dry erase boards. They just hold them up to the camera. And since transitioning to Zoom, we have seen so many props from people's environments. So that's a real enjoyable piece of being virtual. One of our members brought 6 boxes of cereal to our group session last week, because I guess he thought we didn't believe that he loved cereal as much as he does. So he brought the proof. And of course, we continue to engage attendees and try to make sure that everyone has a chance to speak if they want it.
I just remembered that someone showed the baby pig, right? The piglet.
Yes, we did. Pets show up all the time in our group. So we also had to modify our research because of this COVID-19. We took a long break from the group. We switched to Zoom for the group meetings and the assessments, which means we had to transition our assessment tools to a virtual format. We had to get virtual consents. We had to train participants to use the technology. We had to figure out how to use the technology and how to troubleshoot the technology, especially in relation to iPads. So this involved us going through all these procedures and taking screenshots, because we're on desktops or laptops, which don't look the same. So we couldn't even help people troubleshoot on an iPad when we didn't know what they were seeing. And the communication barrier just makes this so much harder, because if you tell someone with aphasia to look at the top right corner of their screen, they will look at you like you have 3 heads. So we're going to talk about results from research question 1 for 3 participants that we've completed testing with. So these are so preliminary. I completely acknowledge that, but I did want to show you guys some things. So we're going to talk about 3 participants here. P1 is in his 60s, 6 years post-stroke with non-fluent aphasia. So this is consistent with the first video that Sena showed you. The other 2 participants have fluent aphasia, which is is more similar to the second video, although these participants are not as impaired as that gentleman. So everyone was in the chronic phases of aphasia recovery, so beyond a year out, and you can see, I mean, 2, 3, 6 years out. So these people are definitely chronic. So here you can see the results from the assessment of living with aphasia. So again, this assessment evaluates these domains. And if you look at these bars in blue, you can see the pre-COVID administration. In green, this is in, October-ish, when we had re-administered before starting our Zoom meetings, and gray is after our 6 Zoom sessions. You can see the aphasia domain here. So this is, word finding, writing, reading, understanding. Participation domain, which is participating in things that you want to in your life, roles, responsibilities, activities. The environment, so barriers and facilitators in your environment. The personal domain, how you feel about your life. And the wall question, which we'll talk about individually in a few slides, and then the total. So 4 is good, 0 is bad. And as you can see here, these folks are largely not improving on this assessment. So you can see a couple of consistent, these are not big changes, but you see a large drop off in participation and personal domain. And we'll talk about this coming up. And then a drop off for the total. For participant 2, you also see a decrease. You see a huge drop off in, fall of 2020, slight, increase in January, February of this year, but still not back to pre-COVID levels. And you see that across a number of these domains. This is the only exception here. And you see a similar pattern for this participant. So you see a decrease in the aphasia domain, participation decreases and then comes back up a little, but still not pre-COVID. Personal is the same, and you see that same trend with the total score. So we do not believe that these results, my video went off, sorry. We do not believe these results are a reflection of participation in our group. We believe that they are really a reflection of COVID-19 and how that's changed how people communicate and who they communicate with, and the modalities involved in that communication. So we saw really big drop-offs in participation. We saw some substantial decreases in the aphasia domain, which is probably because our members with aphasia are experiencing more communication breakdowns because they're having to use the phone a lot more. They're having to use Zoom a lot more. And these methods tend to be much more difficult for people with aphasia, because although language can be a barrier, they're often really effective at, understanding body language and gestures and other modes of communication, which just aren't as easy to access when you're on Zoom, and definitely not easy to access over the phone. So given this information, we've really been thinking carefully about what our next steps will be and how to proceed. And we'll talk about that. We certainly don't want to recruit a lot of participants to try to understand group effects if we're actually measuring something totally different. So that's something we're thinking about and problem solving. We've also considered continuing to follow these 3 individuals throughout the pandemic to see how how they're able to, you know, how their quality of life responds to hopefully things returning to normal, which we all hope is around the corner. So doing this could provide, you know, a little bit of insight into how COVID-19 has affected people with aphasia, albeit with a very small sample. So the one positive finding that we have is that we noticed on this wall question, 2 of our participants did have pretty substantial increases. So this question is how you start the ALA and in the ALA, and it's meant to exemplify how successful you are living with aphasia. So as you see here, this person is looking very sad. This wall represents aphasia. The wall is blocking out the sun and they cannot get over the wall. Here, there is a ladder helping the person get over the wall, but the wall is still a big barrier. And here the person is just stepping over the wall. So for participant 1, before COVID, they were here. And in our most recent test administration, they reported that this was them. So they're finally, you know, starting to get over the wall of aphasia. For P2, she initially reported that she was here. And then at our next administration, she was here. And the most recent, she was also finally starting to feel that she could overcome, you know, aphasia to some degree. So these people are all in the chronic stages of aphasia. So they've been dealing with this for years, not for months. So, you know, first of all, it's heartbreaking that someone would feel like this for years of recovery. And, you know, we see these changes as being really important as a reflection of people's quality of life and living with aphasia. They could potentially indicate that these couple of members are adapting and rebuilding their identity as someone with aphasia, or it could be that COVID-19 has changed their view of aphasia. So, you know, there's so many things happening in the world and some pretty substantial fears for people's lives and for their health that could certainly make aphasia seem different during this time. So we also have these interviews, which we have not fully evaluated yet, but I did want to share a couple of responses from our members. So one of the questions is, how do you see yourself being a strength in an aphasia group? And for participant 2, the first time that I asked her this question, she said, I can see nothing that I can give somebody. And the second time I asked her, or the third time I asked her, she said, I do enlist others. So this is a big emotional shift from, you know, saying I don't have anything to give to saying, hey, you know, I do talk to people, I do ask questions, and she's absolutely right in that. For P3, at pre-testing, he said, some of the other people, I can give them some good stories. And then at the last testing point, he said, I think that I have some input. So these are not very different at all, but I do want to point out that this first quote is really from an outsider standpoint. He's saying he's got stories he can tell people, but here he's saying he has input to the group, that, you know, he can change the group. He's a part of the group. So I thought that that was an interesting way of framing it. And before putting this together, we asked our members if there's anything that they wanted us to share. And here were some of their quotes. They feel the group, or one person felt that the group helps their talking, my interaction with other people. And I think the interaction piece is really key there. One person said it helps with my vocabulary. And then the last person here said, this is good to have other people with aphasia. It's fine to communicate with people who don't have aphasia. My family doesn't understand sometimes. So, you know, at least this person is conveying that they feel the members understand what they're going through in a way that people with aphasia don't. And that's what we want to achieve. That's the real community service piece that we want to achieve for these clients. So we've had many, many challenges in this study and continue to have them. One thing that we've learned is that our Zoom meetings were actually quite successful. We enjoy the meetings, the members enjoy the meetings, they continue to come. They evolved to being less structured, which we like and will continue even when we return face-to-face, which we will one day. And iPads make things really difficult. And they're a constant source of frustration from a tech perspective. So Sena and I have talked very carefully about, and are still talking and thinking and planning carefully about how to proceed, because we feel that, you know, we were capturing changes in people's quality of life due to COVID, and we've all experienced that. And the same way that that deflated our scores, we feel that if we recruit a lot of new people right now, we might have some artificial inflation of quality of life scores if things begin to return to normal, and people are able to participate more. They're not as concerned about, you know, their health. So we have to, you know, think about how to proceed and maybe consider waiting to collect more data until we can resume face-to-face activities. And that's true for control participant testing as well. And we've also been in talks with speech pathologists in the community about expanding to include a group of people with primary progressive aphasia. So the people in our group have stroke-based or brain injury-based aphasia. So it's an acute change. Someone with primary progressive aphasia has a progressive disorder more like Parkinson's, but it affects the language areas of the brain and causes an aphasia that deteriorates over years. So this population has not been studied in terms of response to conversation groups and quality of life, and we would really like to do that. We just have to think about how to proceed with some of the world events that are happening. So that's it for us. Sena and I were worried we wouldn't have enough to talk about, but speech pathologists can always find something to talk about. So thank you guys so much for listening, and I'm happy, or we're both happy to answer questions.
Great, thanks to you both. And I see there's been a lively back and forth in the chat, so that's great having two presenters. Well, one of you have been speaking, the other have been fielding questions. We are a little bit past our time, and so I'll be happy to keep the Zoom room open if folks want to continue to engage. But I just wanted to also just make a quick note that our next event is going to be in April. It'll be an open networking event. And so if you do not currently get the growth emails, you can email me and we will get you added to it so that you can engage in that open networking event. Yeah, so I'll just wanted to make that quick plug in case people have to go. Otherwise, I'll turn things back over so we all can have just an open conversation on this fascinating project. So the field is open for anyone to raise questions.
Thanks, Noah.
I have a question for Sena and Jessica. Of all the things you could do in your life, what brought you to get involved with aphasia?
That's funny.
Great question.
Yeah, in the chat, I just briefly told someone, like in a little private chat, that I don't know if it started. I used to have experiences of aphasia when I'd have migraines. So I was one of those people who used to have complex migraines, and with that, I always had some kind of aphasia, although I think it was different each time. And so it's different. I know it's not the same as like having a stroke and having, lifelong aphasia. But when I experienced it, I always remembered my neurologist friend sharing that when you have one of those complex migraines, it puts you at risk of having a stroke. So I always had this little worry that I would have a stroke and the aphasia would continue. But I just really keenly know that feeling of not being able to find those words, not being able to put a sentence together, and just how scary that was.
My experience is not nearly that compelling. I was a huge communication and language nerd, and I wanted to work in the medical field, and this was such a nice combination of those things. And I initially thought I would specialize in traumatic brain injury, but once I started working as a clinician, I just loved my clients with aphasia. I loved working with them. I loved the therapy, and that's kind of what led me to specialize in aphasia.
We're all better off for that. Thank you.
Thank you. I wrote down your email address, Jose.
Yes, we'll talk sometime later.
So I see in the chat, Ellen is saying that she works in a local PACE program.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's wonderful.
And our folks get a chance to talk in community in the PACE group setting when we're not in shutdown.
Yeah. Yes.
But I don't know that we at any one time have several aphasic people to have a solo conversation group with.
Feel free to send them our way. We allow members who aren't a part of the research to be a part of our group. So, even if we kind of pause on collecting data, they can still join and be a part of the community.
Great. Thank you.
I'm going to share the link from the National Aphasia Association to our group. So let me see if I can pull that, and I'll share it in the chat.
Got it.
Okay. Are all of you very familiar with aphasia?
Yes. I talk so much, I'm really empathetic because it would just drive me crazy if I couldn't find my words and finish my sentence.
I think early on, Jessica, maybe we felt like we needed to all keep each other in check as facilitators to make sure that we weren't talking too much and taking up conversation time that we wanted the group members to have. But I think that's gotten easier over time.
Yeah, everyone gets more comfortable in the group and feels more comfortable interrupting. That's a piece that is always, complicated because people who are new feel like they have to be polite, and those who've been around know that they don't have to.
Well, great. It looks like the conversation has died down a little bit. So I want to thank you both again for coming and speaking with us today. And I see that you shared your contact information in the chat. So for folks who want to follow up, feel free to reach out directly. Or if you're having trouble finding any contact or just want to learn more about the Growth Network sponsoring today's Lunch and Learn, I'm going to put another link to the Growth website. So if this is your first encounter with Growth, we certainly would encourage you to join our mailing list. We do typically around 2 to 3 events like this every semester, just an opportunity for folks from across campus and in the broader community to share what they're doing. And so we're just so excited to celebrate and to shine a light on the amazing work that happens all around us. So thanks for being here today. And hope you all have a good rest of your day and stay safe. And I'm getting my second dose of the vaccine tomorrow, so I'm absolutely thrilled.
Yay.
Congratulations.
All right, bye.
Thanks so
everyone.
much, everybody.
Bye. Thank you for
Bye.
coming.